You're told to be patient while opportunities slip away, watching less strategic colleagues advance because they acted at the right moment. Every day you wait for the perfect time to make your move, yet somehow others seem to know exactly when to strike, while you're left wondering if you're being strategic or just passive. I am Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist who mastered the art of strategic patience, knowing when to wait, when to act, and how to turn time itself into your greatest weapon. What I discovered about strategic patience will transform how you approach timing in your career, giving you the wisdom to act with precision rather than desperation or hesitation. The same principles that determined victory on ancient battlefields can help you master the delicate balance between patience and action in today's competitive workplace. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless strategy, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the art of perfect timing. Let me share with you the broken sword that taught me everything about timing. It sits in my study even now, a constant reminder of the costliest lesson I ever learned about the difference between haste and strategy. I was young then, barely 25, commanding my first significant force in the mountains of ancient China. My soldiers looked to me with a kind of respect reserved for those who had never failed them, and I carried that trust like armor, heavy, protective, and ultimately blinding. The enemy had positioned themselves in a valley below us, seemingly vulnerable, their supply lines stretched thin. Every fiber of my being screamed to attack immediately. My advisors whispered of glory, of the swift victory that would cement my reputation. The moment felt perfect, ripe with opportunity that might never come again. So I struck. My cavalry thundered down those mountain slopes with the fury of a summer storm, my infantry following in tight formation. For the first few minutes, victory seemed certain. Then I watched in horror as the enemy's seeming vulnerability revealed itself as the most elegant trap I had ever witnessed. They had been waiting, not just persisting waiting. They knew we would see their apparent weakness and act on impulse rather than wisdom. Hidden reinforcements emerged from concealed positions. What I had mistaken for stretched supply lines were actually communication networks that allowed them to coordinate a devastating counterdash attack. My broken sword, it shattered when I struck too early against a rock that should have been avoided entirely. The blade I had inherited from my father, the one that had never failed in battle, lay in pieces because I had mistaken urgency for strategy. That defeat cost me 300 good men and nearly my entire career. But in the ashes of that failure, I discovered something that would reshape everything I understood about warfare and timing. My enemy hadn't just been patient, they had weaponized time itself. While I was eager to act, they were busy creating the conditions that would make their eventual action devastating. While I saw delay as lost opportunity, they saw it as preparation for overwhelming advantage. While I feared that waiting meant missing the moment, they understood that waiting could create the moment. I spent the next 2 years studying that defeat, interviewing the surviving enemy commanders, learning how they had turned patience from a passive state into an active weapon. What I discovered changed not just my approach to warfare, but my entire philosophy about power, timing, and strategic advantage. Most people, I realized, confuse patience with passivity because they don't understand the hidden activity that occurs. During periods of apparent waiting, they see the stillness on the surface and miss the intense preparation happening beneath. They mistake strategic patience for indecision, not recognizing it as the most sophisticated form of action. True strategic patience is never about doing nothing. It's about doing everything except the final, decisive action till the moment. When that action becomes inevitable rather than hopeful, it's about creating such overwhelming advantage during the waiting period that when you finally move, victory is already assured. When I finally returned to command, I carried that broken sword as a reminder, not of failure, but of the transformation that failure had created. I had learned to read time like a map, to see patterns others missed, to understand that the most powerful action often looks like inaction to those who don't know what they're observing. That broken sword taught me that timing isn't about waiting for the right moment, it's about creating the right moment through patient, invisible preparation. And once I understood that distinction, I never lost another battle through poor timing again. In my palace garden stands a statue that has confused visitors for centuries. It depicts a general in what appears to be passive contemplation, hands folded, eyes cast downward, seemingly lost in thought. Most observers see weakness, indecision, or philosophical detachment from the urgent demands of leadership. They couldn't be more wrong. That statue captures the moment before my greatest victory, when I appeared motionless while actually orchestrating the most complex strategic positioning of my career. What looks like passive waiting was actually the culmination of months of active preparation, intelligence gathering, and psychological manipulation of my enemies. This is the fundamental misconception that destroys most people's understanding of strategic patience. Society has taught you that patience means sitting quietly, accepting whatever comes, waiting for others to act first. This is not just wrong, it's the opposite of what strategic patience actually requires. Let me tell you what I learned about the difference. Passive patience is what children display when told to wait for dinner, reluctant, powerless, dependent on others' timing. Strategic patience is what a master archer displays while drawing the bow every muscle engaged, every sense alert, power building toward the moment of perfect release. When I appeared to be doing nothing before that great victory, I was actually doing everything. My spies were mapping enemy movements. My engineers were preparing battlefield modifications. My diplomats were creating alliances that would activate at precisely the right moment. My quartermaster was positioning supplies where they would be needed but couldn't be detected. Most importantly, I was studying my enemies' patterns, learning their rhythms, understanding their psychology so completely that I could predict their actions before they made them. Every day of apparent inaction was actually a day of intense strategic activity, just invisible to those who didn't understand what they were observing. This is why the common advice to be patient fails so miserably. In competitive environments, it assumes patience is passive, that waiting means stopping all activity until circumstances change. But strategic patience requires more activity, not less. It demands that you use waiting periods to build overwhelming advantage while your competitors focus on immediate actions. I have watched countless leaders fail because they confused strategic patience with procrastination. Procrastination avoids action out of fear or uncertainty. Strategic patience delays visible action while intensifying invisible preparation. Procrastination hopes circumstances will improve on their own. Strategic patience actively creates the circumstances that will make eventual action devastating. The statue in my garden appears peaceful because it captures strategic patience at its most powerful, the moment when all preparation is complete, all advantages are in place, all variables are controlled, and the only thing remaining is the perfect timing of the final action. That's not passivity. That's power at its most concentrated. Your competitors want you to believe that patience equals weakness because it serves their interests. When you're busy reacting to immediate pressures, you're not building long-term advantages. When you're focused on quick wins, you're not creating sustainable dominance. When you mistake activity for progress, you're playing their game instead of creating your own. Strategic patience isn't about waiting for good things to happen. It's about making inevitable the things you want to happen. It's about building such overwhelming advantage during periods of apparent inaction that when you finally move, your competitors realize they never had a chance. The general in my garden statue looks peaceful because he has already won. He's just waiting for his enemies to discover it. The celestial compass in my war room doesn't point to magnetic north, it points to invisible currents of opportunity that most strategists never learn to detect. I developed this sensitivity through decades of studying not just what my enemies did, but why they did it when they did it. Most people act on what they can see. The wise act on what they can sense. The masters act on what they can predict will become visible to others. When I was 30, I learned to read these invisible currents during a siege that lasted 8 months. My enemy held a fortress that appeared impregnable, with supply lines that seemed secure and morale that appeared unshakable. Traditional military thinking suggested a direct assault or a prolonged blockade. Both approaches would have cost thousands of lives and months of resources. Instead, I spent weeks learning to read the subtler patterns. I noticed that their patrol schedules followed lunar cycles rather than strategic logics, suggesting their commander was superstitious. I observed that their supply convoys arrived with mathematical regularity, indicating they hadn't adapted to wartime unpredictability. Most telling, their sentries grew complacent precisely 73 minutes into each watcher pattern. So consistent it might as well have been announced by trumpet. But the real breakthrough came when I realized their apparent strength was actually the symptom of their greatest weakness. Their fortress looked impregnable because they were terrified of direct confrontation. Their regular supply lines weren't efficient, they were desperate attempts to maintain normalcy in an abnormal situation. Their confident demeanor masked growing anxiety about their ability to sustain the siege. This is what I mean by reading invisible currents. Surface appearances suggested strength, patience, and strategic advantage. The deeper currents revealed fear, rigidity, and approaching collapse. Most commanders would have seen the fortress and planned an attack. I saw the psychology behind the fortress and planned an inevitability. I began sending false intelligence that suggested I was planning a massive assault in spring. Their preparations for this fictional attack revealed their true resource limitations. I had merchants spread rumors about reinforcements that would never come, causing them to extend their supply lines defensively. Most importantly, I did nothing visible for weeks while these psychological pressures built. The invisible currents were shifting. Their confidence was becoming desperation. Their strength was becoming brittleness. Their patience was becoming panic. And then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, when their psychological state had reached the breaking point, they made the mistake I had been waiting for. They sent out a large foraging party, leaving their fortress undermanned. I didn't attack the fortress. I captured the foraging party and used them to deliver a message offering terms of surrender that were actually generous. Within 6 hours, they had opened their gates, not because they were defeated militarily, but because I had read the invisible currents correctly and acted when their psychological state made surrender preferable to continued resistance. This is the difference between reacting to opportunities and creating them. Most people wait for obvious openings and then compete with everyone else who sees the same obvious opportunities. Strategic patience allows you to read the invisible currents that create opportunities before they become visible to others. In your modern workplace, these same currents exist. The colleague who appears confident but consistently checks their phone during meetings is revealing anxiety. The department that seems successful but reports metrics instead of results is showing defensive thinking. The company that emphasizes stability in every communication is usually preparing for major changes. Learn to read what people don't say, what they avoid doing, what they do too consistently. These patterns reveal the invisible currents that determine when opportunities will emerge and how they can be influenced. The celestial compass doesn't create these currents, it simply helps you detect what was always there, waiting for someone wise enough to read the signs and patient enough to act when the moment becomes perfect. The hourglass on my desk measures something far more valuable than time. It measures the accumulation of strategic advantage through deliberate delay. I commissioned it from the finest craftsmen in the kingdom, after discovering that waiting, when done correctly, could exhaust my enemies more effectively than any direct attack. The revelation came during what my historians call the war of attrition, though I prefer to think of it as the war of patience. My opponent commanded superior numbers, better equipment, and more experienced officers. By every conventional measure, I should have sought immediate battle while I still held some advantages. Instead, I chose to make delay my primary weapon. For 3 months, I avoided every engagement he offered, not from cowardice or indecision, but from strategic calculation, while he grew increasingly frustrated with my refusal to fight on his terms. I was systematically dismantling his advantages through the simple act of waiting. His superior numbers became a liability when his larger army consumed supplies faster than mine. His better equipment became irrelevant when I refused to meet him in the type of direct confrontation where equipment mattered most. His experienced officers became impatient advisors, pressuring him toward increasingly desperate actions. Most importantly, his political support, which had been strong when victory seemed quick and certain, began wavering as the campaign dragged on without visible progress. His king grew impatient. His nobles questioned the expense. His soldiers began doubting their commander's competence. During those same 3 months, my position grew stronger daily. My smaller army was easier to feed and house. My defensive positions improved as we fortified them continuously. My intelligence network expanded as local populations grew tired of supporting his larger, more disruptive force. My political support solidified as I appeared measured and strategic rather than aggressive and costly. This is the principle of advantageous delay, making time work for you by ensuring that every day of delay improves your position while weakening your opponents. It requires understanding the different ways that time affects different positions. Most people assume that delay helps both sides equally, or that delay favors whoever is currently winning. This is false. Delay favors whoever has designed their position to improve with time. If your resources, intelligence, alliances, and capabilities grow stronger during waiting periods, while your competitors grow weaker, then delay becomes your most powerful weapon. The psychological dimension is equally important. Impatient opponents reveal their strategies, make poor decisions under pressure, and exhaust their energy fighting battles they don't need to fight. Meanwhile, patient strategists preserve their energy, maintain their options, and force their opponents to operate on emotional rather than logical timelines. I learned to recognize the signs that my delay was working. His challenges became more frequent and desperate. His movements became less coordinated. His communications revealed growing internal conflict. His supporters began suggesting compromise where they had previously demanded victory. When I finally chose to engage, it wasn't because the delay had served its purpose. It was because delay had created such overwhelming advantage that victory was inevitable rather than probable. He faced not just my army, but the accumulated weight of 3 months' worth of deteriorating position, exhausted resources, and eroded confidence. The battle lasted less than 4 hours, but the victory had actually been won during those 3 months when I appeared to be doing nothing while systematically dismantling his ability to succeed. Your competitor's impatience can become your greatest strategic asset. When they demand immediate responses, quick decisions, and fast action, they're often trying to prevent you from building the kind of overwhelming advantage that patient preparation creates. Don't let their urgency become your emergency. Let their haste become your opportunity. The sharpening stone in my armory has worn thin from decades of use, but it represents the most important lesson I can teach about strategic patience. What you do while waiting determines whether delay becomes advantage or merely lost time. During the siege I mentioned earlier, while my enemy believed I was simply avoiding battle. I was conducting the most intensive preparation campaign of my career. Every day of apparent inaction was actually a day of systematic advantage building that would prove decisive when the moment for action arrived. My mornings began before dawn with intelligence briefings. While my opponent focused on immediate tactical concerns, I was mapping every detail of his operation supply schedules, communication patterns, personnel relationships, even the personal habits of his key commanders. This intelligence gathering was invisible to him, but would become devastating when applied at the right moment. My afternoons were spent with my engineers, not planning fortifications, but designing psychological warfare. We created the appearance of massive preparation for a frontal assault while actually preparing for a completely different type of engagement. Every visible activity supported a deception that would make his eventual mistake inevitable. My evenings belonged to my officers, but not for the typical war councils. We studied his previous campaigns, analyzed his decision-making patterns, and developed detailed psychological profiles. By the end of 3 months, I understood his strategic thinking better than his own advisors did. This is what strategic preparation during waiting periods actually involves: building capabilities that your competitors can't see, don't understand, or don't value until it's too late to counter them. Most people waste waiting periods on obvious preparations, baiting resumes during job searches, cramming before interviews, or making last-minute improvements to proposals. This visible preparation often helps, but it's not strategic because your competitors can see it, copy it, or counter it. Strategic preparation during waiting periods focuses on advantages that are invisible until activated. Intelligence about your competitors' real weaknesses, relationships with people who will become influential, skills that seem irrelevant now but will become crucial later, insights about industry changes that others haven't recognized yet. I once spent 6 months appearing to ignore a rival commander while actually studying every battle he had fought for the previous decade. My officers thought I was procrastinating. My advisors worried I was losing focus. But when we finally engaged, I knew his tactical responses so well that the battle felt like following a predetermined script. The key is ensuring that your preparation creates advantages that compound over time rather than capabilities that remain static. Learning your competitors' patterns becomes more valuable the longer you observe them. Building relationships with future decision-makers becomes more powerful as their influence grows. Developing skills that seem unnecessary now becomes more advantageous as circumstances change to make them essential. During waiting periods, most people maintain their current capabilities while hoping for better circumstances. Strategic patience requires building capabilities that will create better circumstances. This means using apparent downtime to gather intelligence others ignore, develop skills others don't value yet, and build relationships others don't see as important. It means treating every day of delay as an opportunity to widen the gap between your capabilities and your competitors' capabilities. When the time for action finally arrives, strategic preparation during waiting periods means you're not just ready or overwhelmingly superior in ways your competitors never saw coming. The sharpening stone grows thinner with each use, but the blade grows sharper. That's the nature of strategic preparation. The effort is visible to you, but invisible to others, while the results become undeniable to everyone. The lightning rod atop my watchtower was forged from bronze, recovered from my greatest victory. When I learnt to recognize the exact moment when strategic patience must transform into decisive action. That moment comes not when you feel ready, but when the convergence of circumstances makes success inevitable rather than probable. I had been observing an enemy formation for 17 days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My officers grew restless. My allies questioned my resolve. Even I began to wonder if I was overthinking the timing. Then, on a humid afternoon, when the air itself seemed charged with potential, I felt the unmistakable sensation that the moment had arrived. It wasn't intuition. It was pattern recognition, refined through years of experience. 3 separate indicators had aligned simultaneously. My enemy's guard rotation had shifted to accommodate a sick officer, creating a 12-minute window of vulnerability. Their supply convoy was running 6 hours late, meaning their reserves were committed elsewhere, and their commander had just received news of political pressure from home, making him psychologically predisposed to defensive rather than aggressive responses. Any one of these factors would have been interesting. Any two would have been significant. All 3 together created what I now recognize as the lightning moment, when circumstances align so perfectly that hesitation becomes the only way to fail. I gave the signal immediately. Within minutes, my forces were moving with the precision that comes from thorough preparation combined with perfect timing. The engagement lasted exactly 47 minutes and resulted in complete victory with minimal casualties. But the real victory had been won in the 17 days of observation that allowed me to recognize when the moment had arrived. This is the most difficult skill in strategic patience, learning to distinguish between good timing and perfect timing. Good timing means favorable circumstances. Perfect timing means inevitable success if you act decisively. The physical signals are subtle but unmistakable once you learn to recognize them. Your pulse quickens, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. Your vision sharpens as if the world has suddenly come into focus. Your mind stops analyzing and starts calculating. Most importantly, the decision to act stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a natural response to obvious circumstances. The mental signals are even more telling. Doubt disappears, not because you're certain of success, but because you're certain that this is the right moment, regardless of outcome. Questions stop arising because the variables have aligned in ways that answer themselves. The complexity that made you wait suddenly resolves into clarity that makes action obvious. I learned to trust these signals completely, but only after years of learning to distinguish them from false alarms. Wishful thinking can mimic the sensation of perfect timing. Impatience can disguise itself as strategic insight. Fear of missing opportunities can create pseudo-moments that feel urgent but lack the convergence of actual perfect timing. The difference is this: perfect timing feels calm, rather than urgent, inevitable rather than opportunistic, and simple rather than complex. When the moment arrives, you don't need to convince yourself to act, you need to trust yourself to act. Most people miss perfect timing because they're looking for permission rather than recognition. They wait for external validation, clearer signals, or reduced risk. But perfect timing rarely announces itself obviously. It requires the sensitivity that comes from strategic patience combined with the confidence that comes from thorough preparation. The lightning rod doesn't create lightning. It simply provides the perfect path for energy that was already building. When you've prepared strategically and waited patiently, you become the lightning rod for opportunities that were always going to strike somewhere. The moment of recognition is when you realize that somewhere is here, and the time is now. The falcon's talon hanging in my trophy room strikes faster than the human I can follow, but only after hours of patient observation from its hidden perch. This perfect balance between strategic patience and lightning execution represents the most crucial transition in all of warfare. The moment when waiting transforms into unstoppable action. I learned this lesson during what became known as the Battle of the River Crossing, where months of careful positioning culminated in exactly 90 seconds of decisive action that determined the outcome of an entire campaign. For 4 months, I had positioned my forces to appear focused on a heavily defended bridge while secretly preparing for a crossing 12 miles upstream. My enemy concentrated his defenses exactly where I wanted them, convinced that my obvious preparations revealed my true intentions. During those 4 months of apparent focus on the wrong location, I was actually building the capability to move my entire army across the river. In less than 2 hours, when the moment arrived, when my scouts signaled that the upstream crossing was clear and the enemy was committed to defending the bridge, I had perhaps a 3-hour window before they could reposition their forces. But I didn't take 3 hours. I took 90 minutes, moving with such speed and precision that by the time they realized what was happening, my army was already across and positioned for devastating attack. The speed wasn't reckless. It was the inevitable result of months of preparation. Every soldier knew exactly where to go and what to do. Every piece of equipment was positioned for maximum efficiency. Every contingency had been planned and rehearsed. The crossing wasn't fast because we hurried. It was fast because we had eliminated every source of delay through patient preparation. This is why strategic patience requires lightning-fast execution. All the advantage you build through waiting is worthless if you can't convert it into action faster than your competitors can respond. The longer you take to act once the moment arrives, the more time you give them to counter your advantages or escape your trap. Most people think that patient preparation leads to careful, measured action. This is backwards. Patient preparation should lead to explosive, overwhelming action that your opponents cannot match or counter. The patience is in the preparation. The violence is in the execution. I have seen commanders ruin months of strategic patience by acting tentatively when the moment finally arrived. They second-guessed themselves, moved incrementally, or tried to preserve options instead of committing fully to the action their preparation had made possible. When the moment for action arrives, hesitation becomes your greatest enemy. Not because waiting is bad, but because partial action wastes all the advantages that strategic patience has created. If you're going to act completely. If you're not ready to act completely, continue waiting until you are. The transition from patience to action should feel like releasing a compressed spring. All the energy you've built up through strategic waiting gets unleashed in a concentrated burst that your competitors cannot match, because they haven't done the preparation. Speed of execution multiplies the advantage of strategic patience. Slow execution dissipates it. This is why the falcon waits motionless for hours before striking with such speed that its prey never knows what happened. When your moment arrives, strike like the falcon. Everything you've built through strategic patience depends on it. The mirror of polished bronze in my strategy chamber reflects more than appearances. It reveals the psychological state of whoever gazes into it. I placed it there after discovering that strategic patience creates its most powerful effects, not through what you do, but through what others think about what you're not doing. During the siege of the Three Valleys, I learned that my composure during extended waiting periods had become a weapon more devastating than any catapult. My enemy's commanders would emerge from their war councils visibly shaken, not by any action I had taken, but by their inability to predict or provoke my next move. For 6 weeks, I maintained perfect strategic patience while they grew increasingly desperate for any sign of my intentions. They sent provocative raids to test my resolve, responded with measured defensive actions that revealed nothing about my capabilities or timeline. They positioned their forces in obviously vulnerable formations to tempt premature attack. I observed carefully but refused to take the bait. Most importantly, I maintained the same daily routine regardless of their provocations. My morning inspections occurred at precisely the same time. My evening strategy meetings followed identical schedules. My meals were taken with the same unhurried deliberation, whether they were launching attacks or offering negotiations. This consistency in the face of their chaos became psychologically unbearable for them. They began making increasingly irrational decisions, trying anything that might provoke a reaction that would reveal my thinking. Their communications became frantic. Their movements became erratic. Their confidence deteriorated into paranoia about what I might be planning. The psychological pressure was so intense that they began fighting among themselves about the best way to deal with my apparent invulnerability to their attempts at manipulation. Their unity fractured as different factions advocated for different approaches to solving the problem of my strategic patience. Here's what I learned. When you maintain perfect composure during high-pressure situations, your opponents begin to attribute almost supernatural wisdom to your actions. They assume that your patience indicates knowledge they don't possess, capabilities they can't detect, or plans they can't fathom. This psychological advantage compounds over time. The longer you maintain strategic patience, while others grow increasingly agitated, the more they begin to doubt their own judgment and overestimate your position. They start seeing threats that don't exist, opportunities that are actually traps, and weaknesses that are actually strengths. Your silence becomes more intimidating than any threat. Your inaction becomes more ominous than any preparation they can observe. Your patience becomes evidence of confidence so complete that it suggests inevitable victory. But this psychological warfare through timing requires absolute authenticity. You cannot fake the mental state that creates genuine strategic patience. If you're anxious, frustrated, or uncertain, these emotions will leak through your behavior and destroy the psychological advantage you're trying to create. True strategic patience creates a psychological presence that is simultaneously calm and dangerous, patient and powerful, peaceful and utterly prepared for decisive action. This combination is so rare and so impressive that opponents often defeat themselves trying to understand it. The mirror reflects not just your appearance, but your mental state. When you look into it during periods of strategic patience, you should see someone who appears completely comfortable with uncertainty, absolutely confident in their eventual success, and entirely unbothered by pressure that would break weaker minds. When your opponents look at you, they should see the same thing, and when they do, they'll begin making the mistakes that strategic patience was designed to provoke. The ceremonial mask displayed in my war room has two faces, one serene, one fierce, representing the sophisticated art of making your opponents believe your timing when your actual timing serves a completely different purpose, the greatest. Strategic patience often requires convincing others that you're ready to act when you're not, or that you're unprepared when you're perfectly positioned. I perfected this deception during the campaign of the False Dawn, where I spent 3 months convincing my enemy that I was preparing for a major assault in spring, while actually preparing for a completely different type of engagement in winter. Every visible action supported the spring assault deception. My supply orders emphasized materials needed for siege warfare. My troop movements suggested positioning for the type of frontal attack that would be most effective after winter ended. My communications, which I allowed to be intercepted, discussed spring weather patterns and their tactical implications. Meanwhile, my real preparations were invisible. I was training a select force for winter mountain warfare. I was establishing supply caches for a campaign that would begin in the harshest weather. I was developing relationships with local guides who knew passes that would be available even in deep snow. The psychological dimension was crucial. My enemy needed to believe not just that I was planning a spring assault, but that I was the type of commander who would plan such an obvious approach. So I cultivated the appearance of being straightforward, conventional, and predictable in my strategic thinking. I allowed him to discover false intelligence that confirmed his assumptions about my character and capabilities. I made decisions that seemed to demonstrate the kind of tactical limitations he expected from someone of my apparent background. I even allowed some of my own officers to believe in the spring assault plan, knowing that their genuine conviction would make the deception more convincing. When winter arrived, My enemy settled into defensive positions, designed to counter the spring assault he was certain I was planning. His forces were distributed incorrectly for winter defense. His supply lines were optimized for spring operations. His psychological preparation was entirely focused on waiting through winter for the real campaign to begin. That's when I struck. My winter-trained force moved through mountain passes his scouts had dismissed as impassable. We attacked positions he had left lightly defended because they seemed irrelevant to spring operations. Most importantly, we achieved complete surprise because his entire strategic framework was built around false assumptions about my timing and intentions. The key to successful timing deception is ensuring that your false signals are completely consistent with what your opponents want to believe about you. Don't try to convince them of something that conflicts with their existing assumptions. Reinforce their assumptions while secretly preparing something entirely different. This requires understanding not just what your opponents think, but why they think it. Their strategic assumptions are usually based on their own limitations, their previous experiences, or their analysis of your past behavior. Use these psychological patterns to make your deception feel inevitable rather than suspicious. The most sophisticated timing deception makes your opponents feel clever for seeing through what they think is your strategy, while remaining completely blind to your actual strategy. They congratulate themselves for anticipating your moves, while you prepare moves they can't imagine. The two-faced mask reminds me that strategic patience sometimes requires wearing the face your opponents need to see while hiding the face that will ultimately defeat them. The immovable mountain stone in my meditation garden has weathered 10,000 storms without shifting position, representing the inner strength required to maintain strategic patience when everyone around you demands immediate action. The greatest test of strategic timing comes not from external enemies, but from allies who don't understand why you refuse to act. I faced this ultimate test during the crisis of the burning capital, when political pressure to act immediately nearly destroyed the strategic patience that would eventually save the empire. Enemy forces had captured our secondary capital and were demanding surrender within 7 days, or they would execute the captured population and advance on our primary stronghold. My advisors demanded immediate action. My generals insisted that honor required immediate response. The noble families whose relatives were captured applied every form of pressure they could devise. Even my closest allies began questioning whether my strategic patience had become paralysis in the face of moral emergency. For 6 days and nights, I maintained my position that immediate action would result in total defeat and the deaths of everyone we were trying to save. The pressure was unlike anything I had experienced. Not just external pressure from those who wanted action, but internal pressure from my own desire to do anything that might help people who were suffering because of strategic decisions I had made. On the morning of the 7th day, with execution scheduled for sunset, I was still refusing to authorize the rescue mission that everyone believed was our only option. My commanders were barely speaking to me. Some of my allies were openly discussing whether I had lost my capacity for decisive leadership, but my strategic patience wasn't based on indifference to suffering or paralysis in the face of complexity. It was based on intelligence that suggested the entire crisis was a carefully orchestrated trap designed to force exactly the kind of immediate response that everyone was demanding. My spies had discovered that the captured population was being held in a location that could be easily defended against rescue attempts, but was vulnerable to a completely different type of approach. My scouts had identified that the enemy forces demanding surrender were themselves stretched dangerously thin by the speed of their advance. Most importantly, my analysts had determined that their 7-day ultimatum was designed around their own resource limitations. They couldn't maintain their current position much longer regardless of our response. So while everyone demanded immediate action, I continued implementing a strategy that would resolve the crisis completely, rather than simply responding to its immediate symptoms. On the evening of the 7th day, while the enemy was positioned to repel the rescue mission they expected, my forces struck their actual headquarters 40 miles away, capturing their leadership and rendering their threats meaningless. The captured population was freed within hours. The enemy advance collapsed without their command structure. The strategic patience that had seemed like cowardice revealed itself as the only approach that could save everyone involved. Here's what I learned about maintaining strategic patience. Under extreme pressure, you must be absolutely certain that your patience serves a strategic purpose rather than emotional avoidance. When people are suffering, when time seems to be running out, when everyone you trust is telling you to act immediately, strategic patience requires moral courage as well as tactical wisdom. The pressure to abandon strategic patience is often strongest just before strategic patience would achieve its greatest success. Your opponents know this, which is why they create artificial urgency designed to force premature action. Your allies don't always know this, which is why they may unintentionally become instruments of your enemy's pressure campaign. The mountain stone doesn't move because it understands something about permanence that temporary storms cannot comprehend. Sometimes strategic patience requires the same understanding. The bamboo seed in my private collection spent 7 years growing invisibly underground before shooting up 20 feet in a single season, perfectly demonstrating why strategic patience creates exponential rather than linear results. Most people abandon their strategies because they expect steady progress, not understanding that the greatest advantages often remain invisible until they suddenly become overwhelming. I discovered this principle during what became my longest campaign, a 5-year strategic patience operation that appeared to accomplish nothing for 4 years and 11 months before achieving total victory in a matter of weeks. My target was not a military enemy, but a political rival whose influence had grown so powerful that direct confrontation would have been futile. He controlled key trade routes, commanded loyalty from important military commanders, and had built alliances that made him nearly untouchable through conventional means. Instead of attempting immediate action that would have failed, I began building what I call compound advantages, small, seemingly insignificant improvements in my position that would become exponentially more powerful as they accumulated over time. Year 1, I focused on building relationships with young officers who showed promise but were currently unimportant. While my rival courted the established commanders, I invested time in future leaders who would remember my early confidence in their abilities. Year 2, I began establishing alternative trade relationships that seemed minor compared to my rivals' major routes. These alternatives appeared economically insignificant, but they gave me leverage and knowledge that would become crucial later. Year 3, I started documenting patterns in my rival's decision-making, building a comprehensive understanding of his strategic psychology. This seemed like academic exercise, but it was actually intelligence gathering that would allow me to predict and counter his responses. Year 4, I cultivated relationships with his allies' younger family members, the sons and daughters, who would inherit influence but were currently ignored. These relationships appeared social rather than strategic, but they were actually long-term positioning for inevitable generational changes. For nearly 5 years, these activities produced no visible results. My rival's power continued growing, his influence continued expanding. Many of my own advisors questioned whether my approach was working or whether simply avoiding direct confrontation out of fear. Then everything changed at once. Political circumstances shifted in ways that made his main trade routes vulnerable. The young officers I had cultivated reached positions of real influence. The alternative relationships I had built became primary pathways for economic and military power. The psychological insights I had gathered allowed me to anticipate and counter his responses to the changing situation. The relationships with his allies, family members, became sources of insight. Information about his increasingly desperate strategies. Within 6 weeks, his seemingly unshakable power structure collapsed completely. Not because I had attacked it directly, but because I had spent 5 years building an alternative structure that became exponentially more powerful when circumstances changed. This is how compound advantages work. Small, consistent improvements in your strategic position create exponential rather than linear results when they reach critical mass. The bamboo appears dormant while its root system grows invisibly, but when it's ready, nothing can stop its growth. Most people abandon strategic patience because they expect immediate results from their investments. They don't understand that the greatest strategic advantages often remain invisible until they suddenly become unstoppable. Your competitors may appear to be winning while you're building compound advantages. Let them enjoy their temporary victories while you construct permanent superiority. The bamboo doesn't concern itself with the weeds that grow faster. It knows that when its time comes, nothing in the garden will be able to compete with its growth. The synchronized war bells in my alliance chamber could only create their perfect harmony when each bell rang at precisely the right moment in relationship to all the others, teaching me that strategic patience in collaborative environments requires orchestrating multiple timelines rather than controlling a single one. My greatest lesson in collaborative timing came during the alliance of the 5 kingdoms, where coordinating strategic patience across multiple leaders with different perspectives, resources, and political pressures nearly proved impossible until I learned to treat timing, coordination, as its own strategic discipline. Each kingdom faced different pressures and operated on different timelines. The Mountain Kingdom needed to act before winter made their passes impassable. The Coastal Kingdom required coordination with favorable tide cycles. The Agricultural Kingdom had to consider planting seasons that couldn't be delayed. The Trade Kingdom needed to account for caravan schedules that were already committed. My own kingdom faced political pressures that demanded visible progress within specific timeframes. Traditional alliance coordination would have sought the earliest common timing that satisfied everyone's constraints. This approach almost always results in premature action because it optimizes for convenience rather than strategic advantage. Instead, I proposed that we optimize our individual timelines to create maximum collective advantage, even if this meant some kingdoms would need to maintain strategic patience longer than they preferred, while others prepared to act earlier than they would choose. Independently, the Mountain Kingdom, despite their winter deadline, agreed to extend their timeline by establishing winter supply caches that would allow operations even after the passes closed. The Coastal Kingdom adjusted their operations to take advantage of tide cycles that occurred later than they had originally planned. The Agricultural Kingdom modified their crop planning to accommodate a later timeline, while actually improving their eventual harvest yields. Most importantly, I helped each kingdom understand how their individual strategic patience was creating advantages for the alliance that would benefit everyone exponentially more than individual early action would benefit any single kingdom. The coordination required constant communication about timing signals that each kingdom was observing. When the Mountain Kingdom detected changes in their enemies' winter preparations, this information helped other kingdoms adjust their timelines. When the Coastal Kingdom identified optimal tide patterns, this intelligence influenced everyone's operational planning. We developed what I called synchronized patience system, where each alliance member maintained strategic patience until specific signals indicated that coordinated action would be overwhelmingly advantageous for the collective effort. The breakthrough came when all 5 kingdoms simultaneously detected that their individual enemies were making the same type of strategic mistakes at the same time. This wasn't coincidence. It was the result of coordinated pressure that our synchronized, strategic patience had created across multiple fronts. When we finally acted, it was with such coordination and overwhelming advantage that the entire regional power structure shifted in our favor within a single campaign season. None of the kingdoms could have achieved such complete success through individual action, regardless of their timing. The war bells taught me that collaborative, strategic patience requires each participant to trust that their individual restraint serves collective advantage. It requires constant communication about timing, signals, and shared understanding of what indicators will trigger coordinated action. Most importantly, it requires leadership that can help each participant see how their patience contributes to eventual success that benefits everyone more than immediate individual action would benefit anyone. The cracked bell in my hall of lessons rings with a discordant tone that reminds me daily of my greatest timing failure, the moment I acted 3 days too early and learned that premature action teaches more about strategic patience than perfect timing ever could. This failure occurred during the siege of the Western Pass, where I had spent 4 months building perfect strategic position, only to destroy it with 72 hours of impatience that cost me 6 months of additional campaign and nearly 300 good soldiers. My intelligence indicated that the enemy commander was preparing to abandon his position due to dwindling supplies and political pressure from his capital. My preparation was complete. My advantages were overwhelming. My soldiers were perfectly positioned. Everything suggested that strategic patience had created the exact circumstances I needed for inevitable victory. Then I received intelligence that seemed to indicate the enemy was planning a desperate night attack that would force engagement on his terms rather than mine. The source was reliable. The logic was sound. The threat appeared immediate and serious. So I abandoned my strategic patience and struck first. The intelligence was accurate. He was indeed planning a night attack. But what I failed to recognize was that his desperation made this attack more valuable to me than to him. If I had maintained strategic patience for 3 more days, his desperate attack would have failed against my prepared positions, leaving him completely vulnerable with no remaining options. Instead, my premature action allowed him to respond to immediate threat rather than growing desperation. It gave him the kind of focused enemy he needed to rally his forces around, transforming his weakness into a source of renewed strength. Most importantly, it moved the engagement to his timeline rather than the timeline my strategic patience had been designed to create. The battle lasted 6 hours, instead of the 40 minutes I had anticipated. We won, but at tremendous cost, and without the overwhelming advantage that 3 more days of strategic patience would have provided. Worse, the victory was incomplete. He escaped with enough forces to regroup and continue resistance for another 6 months. That cracked bell rang the moment I gave the premature attack order, and its discordant tone perfectly captured the sound of strategic patience being destroyed by momentary impatience. Here's what that failure taught me about timing. Mistakes, they usually occur not when you know too little, but when you think you know enough. I had excellent intelligence, sound reasoning, and legitimate concerns about the threat his planned attack represented, but I acted on information rather than wisdom, on analysis rather than strategic understanding. The key lesson was learning to distinguish between information that requires immediate response and information that should influence strategic patience without destroying it. Threats that seem to demand immediate action often benefit from strategic patience that transforms the threat into advantage. I also learned that recovering from timing failures requires accepting the full cost of your mistake without trying to minimize it through rationalization. My decision to act early was wrong regardless of the reasonable justifications I had for making it. Accepting this completely allowed me to learn from it completely. Most importantly, I learned that timing failures create opportunities to develop better timing instincts. The pain of premature action teaches recognition patterns that prevent similar mistakes. The cost of poor timing creates appreciation for good timing that theoretical understanding cannot provide. The cracked bell reminds me that strategic patience is not a talent you're born with, it's a skill you develop through the painful experience of learning what happens when you abandon it too soon. The master's chess set in my strategy chamber features pieces that move according to multiple timing systems simultaneously, representing the sophisticated interplay of layered timing strategies that separate novice patience from master level. Strategic thinking. After decades of developing strategic patience, I learned that the most powerful applications involve orchestrating multiple timing strategies that operate independently but converge for exponential advantage. This advanced approach requires thinking several levels beyond simple patience versus action. My masterpiece in this regard was the campaign of the 7 convergences, where I simultaneously operated 7 different timing strategies, each building advantage on different timescales, all designed to reach peak effectiveness within the same 2-week period. Strategy 1 operated on a 2-year timeline, gradually weakening my enemy's economic foundation through seemingly unrelated trade decisions that accumulated into serious resource constraints. Strategy 2 worked on a 1-year cycle, systematically cultivating relationships with his key allies, subordinates who would become influential exactly when I needed them. Strategy 3 followed seasonal patterns, preparing for weather conditions that would advantage my forces during the planned engagement period. Strategy 4 operated on monthly cycles, gathering intelligence about his decision-making, patterns that would allow me to predict his responses during the critical period. Strategy 5 worked on weekly rhythms, conditioning his forces to expect certain types of activity from my army while preparing completely different capabilities. Strategy 6 followed daily patterns, training my officers in coordination techniques they would need for the complex final operation. Strategy 7 operated on hourly precision, developing communication systems that would allow real-time coordination during the decisive engagement. Each strategy produced its own benefits and could have succeeded independently, but their real power emerged from convergence, when all 7 strategies reached peak effectiveness simultaneously. The cumulative advantage was overwhelming in ways that no single timing strategy could have achieved. The economic pressure from Strategy 1 made him vulnerable exactly when the relationship advantages from Strategy 2 gave me inside information about his desperate attempts to counter the seasonal disadvantages that Strategy 3 had prepared me to exploit. His predictable responses, mapped by Strategy 4, allowed me to deploy the deceptive capabilities that Strategy 5 had developed, while the coordination systems from Strategies 6 and 7 enabled execution that was faster and more precise than he could counter. This convergence created what I call cascade advantage, where multiple timing strategies reinforce each other to create results that are exponentially greater than their sum. It requires thinking like a master orchestrator rather than a single instrument performer. The key to managing multiple timing strategies is ensuring they support rather than interfere with each other. Each strategy must be valuable independently, while contributing to collective advantage. This requires understanding how different timescales interact and planning for convergence points, where multiple advantages can be activated simultaneously. Most importantly, advanced timing strategies require the mental capacity to maintain strategic patience on multiple levels, while tracking numerous variables and timeline interactions. It's exponentially more complex than single strategy patience, but it creates exponentially more powerful results. The chess set reminds me that strategic thinking at the highest levels involves playing multiple games simultaneously, where each game follows different rules and timelines, but all games contribute to the same ultimate victory. The pieces move according to their individual timing requirements, but the master player coordinates all movements toward convergent advantage. This level of strategic patience takes years to develop and requires constantly expanding your capacity to think across multiple timescales simultaneously. But once mastered, it creates advantages so overwhelming that your opponents often surrender, not because they've been defeated, but because they finally understand the level of strategic thinking they're facing. The master's chess set doesn't just teach timing, it teaches the orchestration of time itself. The bridge spanning the gorge outside my palace connects two different eras of landscape shaped by millennia and modern valleys, carved by recent rivers, representing how timeless timing principles must adapt to contemporary environments without losing their essential power. Your modern world moves faster than any I experienced, yet the fundamental principles of strategic patience have become more valuable, not less. The acceleration of business, technology, and communication has created environments where everyone expects immediate results, making strategic patience a rarer and therefore more powerful competitive advantage. In my era, strategic patience was common among leaders because circumstances forced long-term thinking. Supply chains took months, communications required weeks, political changes developed over seasons. Everyone understood that significant results required extended timelines. Your era has convinced most people that everything should happen immediately. They expect instant communication, rapid delivery, and quick resolution of complex problems. This widespread impatience creates unprecedented opportunities for those who master strategic patience. When everyone around you is focused on quarterly results, strategic patience allows you to build advantages that compound over years. When your competitors are reacting to daily market fluctuations, strategic patience lets you prepare for changes they haven't recognized yet. When your colleagues are rushing toward immediate solutions, strategic patience gives time to develop approaches that solve underlying problems rather than symptoms. The same principles I use to read invisible currents of opportunity apply perfectly to your modern environment. Political patterns in your organizations follow the same psychological rhythms they always have. Economic pressures create predictable responses that strategic patience can anticipate and exploit. Competitive dynamics still reward those who can build overwhelming advantage, while others focus on immediate positioning. Your technology actually enhances strategic patience rather than obsoleting it. Information systems allow you to gather intelligence faster and more comprehensively than any ancient spy network. Communication tools enable coordination of complex timing strategies across global distances. Data analysis provides pattern recognition capabilities that can identify optimal timing with unprecedented precision. But your technology also creates new forms of pressure that test strategic patience more severely than ancient battlefields ever did. Constant connectivity makes it harder to maintain the mental calm that strategic patience requires. Real-time information creates false urgency about situations that would benefit from patient analysis. Social media amplifies the psychological pressure to respond immediately to every development. The solution is not avoiding modern tools, but using them to support strategic patience rather than undermining it. Use information systems to build better intelligence about timing patterns rather than reacting to every data point. Use communication tools to coordinate strategic patience with allies rather than responding to every urgent message. Use analysis capabilities to identify when strategic patience will create advantage rather than when immediate action might avoid problems. Most importantly, recognize that your competitor's addiction to speed creates opportunities for strategic patience that didn't exist in slower moving eras. When everyone else is moving fast, moving thoughtfully becomes a competitive advantage. When everyone else is reacting immediately, responding strategically becomes overwhelming superiority. The bridge connects different landscapes, but the engineering principles that make it stable remain constant across changing environments. Strategic patience in your modern context requires adapting ancient wisdom to contemporary circumstances, while maintaining the fundamental understanding that time, properly used, becomes your most powerful weapon. Your fast-moving world needs strategic patience more than ever, precisely because so few people have the wisdom or discipline to practice it consistently. The craftsman's tools displayed in my workshop were forged specifically for measuring and working with time, each instrument calibrated to help develop the precise timing instincts that transform strategic patience from occasional insight into consistent competitive advantage. Building mastery in strategic patience requires more than understanding principles. It demands developing systematic practices that strengthen your timing instincts, the way physical training strengthens muscles. After decades of refinement, I have identified the essential elements of a strategic patience system that can be adapted to any modern context. Your daily observation practice forms the foundation. Each morning, spend precisely 15 minutes analyzing one competitive situation where timing will determine outcomes. Not planning your response, but studying the timing patterns. Notice how different people respond to pressure. Observe how urgency affects decision quality. Track how competitive advantages shift over different timescales. This daily practice builds the pattern recognition that allows you to sense timing opportunities others miss. Your weekly intelligence gathering must focus on information that reveals timing rather than just facts. What pressures are your competitors facing that might affect their timeline? What resources are they depleting that will influence their endurance? What political or economic factors are building that will change the competitive landscape? This intelligence allows you to position for timing advantages that aren't visible yet. Your monthly strategic reviews should evaluate your patience decisions with the same rigor you apply to action decisions. When did you wait when you should have acted? When did you act when patience would have served you better? What patterns in your timing decisions reveal strengths and weaknesses in your strategic patience? This honest analysis develops better timing instincts through systematic learning. Your quarterly positioning assessments must examine how your strategic patience is building compound advantages. What capabilities are you developing during waiting periods? What intelligence are you gathering that competitors don't have? What relationships are you building that will become valuable? This assessment ensures your patience serves strategic purposes rather than becoming passive avoidance. Most importantly, your annual timeline planning should identify the optimal timing for major initiatives based on predictable cycles in your competitive environment. When do budget decisions get made? When do personnel changes typically occur? When do market conditions favor your type of strategic moves? This long-term planning allows you to coordinate strategic patience with natural timing opportunities. The mental habits that support strategic patience require constant cultivation. Practice maintaining composure under artificial urgency. Develop comfort with uncertainty by deliberately choosing situations where outcomes can't be predicted. Build confidence in delayed gratification by starting with small timing decisions that demonstrate how patience creates advantage. Your communication system must help others understand your strategic patience without revealing your timeline or intentions. Learn to explain your thoughtful approach without appearing indecisive. Practice conveying confidence in your eventual action without committing to premature timing. Develop language that builds support for patient approaches in environments that prefer immediate action. The physical environment that supports strategic patience should minimize sources of false urgency while maximizing your ability to observe patterns and think clearly. Remove notifications that create pressure to respond immediately to non-urgent situations. Create spaces where you can think without interruption. Establish routines that support calm, strategic thinking rather than reactive decision-making. Remember that building a strategic patience system takes time to show results, which is itself an exercise in strategic patience. The tools become more effective as your instincts develop. The practices reveal their value as your pattern recognition improves. The system creates compound advantages that become undeniable as your timing mastery grows. The eternal flame in my memorial hall burns continuously, representing how mastery of strategic patience creates impact that transcends individual victories to influence generations of leaders who understand that time, properly wielded, becomes the most enduring form of power. As I reflect on a lifetime devoted to perfecting the art of strategic patience, I see how this discipline has created ripples that extend far beyond my own campaigns and victories. The commanders I trained carry these principles into their own leadership. The strategies I developed continue influencing military thinking centuries after my death. Most importantly, the understanding that timing can be mastered rather than merely hoped for has transformed how thoughtful leaders approach every form of competition. Strategic patience creates legacy because it teaches sustainable approaches to power and influence. Leaders who rely on immediate action, quick wins, and reactive strategies often achieve impressive short-term results, but their methods cannot be sustained or replicated consistently. Strategic patience, once mastered, becomes a renewable resource that grows more powerful with experience and creates advantages that compound. Across decades, the responsibility that comes with timing mastery extends beyond personal success. When you understand how to read invisible currents of opportunity, you have an obligation to use this knowledge wisely. When you can predict how impatience will destroy your competitors' strategies, you must ensure your patience serves justice rather than mere ambition. When you possess the rare ability to create timing rather than merely react to it, you bear responsibility for the consequences of your strategic choices. This is why I have shared these principles with you. Strategic patience is too valuable to remain confined to military applications or ancient contexts. Your modern world desperately needs leaders who understand that the greatest challenges require patient, strategic thinking rather than immediate, reactive responses. Climate change, economic inequality, political polarization, technological disruption, these challenges demand the kind of long-term strategic thinking that only patient leaders can provide. They require building advantages over years or decades, not quarters or election cycles. They need leaders who can maintain composure under pressure, think beyond immediate crises, and create sustainable solutions rather than temporary fixes. The flame burns eternally because strategic patience, once learned, never becomes obsolete. The specific tactics change with technology and circumstances, but the fundamental understanding that time can be weaponized for good or ill remains constant across all human endeavors. Your challenge now is to take these principles and adapt them to your own circumstances, your own goals, your own vision of what patient strategic thinking can achieve. Whether you're building a career, leading an organization, or working to solve problems that matter, strategic patience will give you advantages that reactive approaches cannot match. But remember this final lesson: strategic patience without worthy purpose becomes mere procrastination, and strategic patience without moral foundation becomes manipulation. The true mastery lies not just in perfect timing, but in using perfect timing to create outcomes that honor the patience required to achieve them. The eternal flame reminds us that some achievements transcend the individuals who create them. Master the art of strategic patience, and you join a lineage of leaders whose influence extends far beyond their own lifetimes, whose timing created opportunities for generations they would never meet, whose patience changed the world. Now go. Your moment of strategic patience has arrived.